All right, welcome everybody again to Purposeful Patriarchs. Again, where in the previous video we discussed something called the Moynihan report, just detailing exactly a Department of Labour report that was produced in the 1960s, 1965, trying to address the Negro crisis in America, as it was termed back then, and just looking at the breakdown of what caused the main issues for black people, and it will be broken down into three different things. We touched upon the first one, which is the biggest factor, which is a term that was very inflammatory when the report came out, which it stated that there was a racist virus in the American bloodstream which still affects the black people in America. And then the second aspect was the fact that they've suffered 3 centuries of sometimes unimaginable mistreatment. What we're going to do now is go into chapter 2, which was the Negro American family, and I will actually break down and quantify some of those terms, like the racist virus in America. What was it back then that still affected the black people? And I've mapped it out from the time of slavery and racism, then Jim Crow, segregation, emancipation, and all of the time in between, and it is quite a difficult subject to actually discuss, so I will take my time to do that. So maybe in about 5 or 6 episodes, because I do want to make this quite interactive, quite fun, quite research based, because at the end of the day I don't want to be misconstrued or misquoted, and also I want to try and provide as much evidence to inform the wider society, but in particular black men and black women, to kind of try and get things going, to kind of see whether things have changed, how do we change them, look into the spiritual reasons. But today we're going to focus on chapter 2 of the Moynihan report, which is the Negro American family. Okay, so what I'll do is I will switch screen, okay, and then we'll read this stuff together. Okay, so this would be chapter 2. Chapter 2, here you go, chapter 2, there you go. So let's, this is quite small, so I'll zoom in on that. Okay, so it says, and again, this is a summary for everybody. Okay, so let me just make sure that everyone can see what I'm doing. Okay, so basically there is probably no single fact of Negro American life so little understood by whites. The Negro situation is commonly perceived by whites in terms of the visible manifestation of discrimination and poverty, in part because Negro protest is directed against such obstacles, and in part no doubt because there are facts which involve the actions and attitudes of white community as well. It is more difficult, however, for whites to perceive the effect of 3 centuries of exploitation have had on the fabric of the Negro society itself. And sometimes you do actually see this when you do discuss slavery and racism. A lot of the dominant society don't truly understand what has happened to black people, because they just see the effects. And this is because I think when you read this actual report, and I would always encourage everybody to actually go and read this report for yourself. It's up on the Department of Labour website in the United States. One of the things, and you'll see it all the time, is like, why do we still have to talk about it? Whether it's, they just see it as discrimination and poverty, but there is so much going on that, as this report stated, because of the slavery and the racism, this has actually destroyed the fabric of their society, and to be honest, this is probably still affecting them today. And what I want to try and do is I will actually put some of the intervening issues that have happened since slavery and racism, because I think it's because sometimes when you have these discussions, it's very easy to say, oh, it's just slavery and racism, but there's so many things that have happened in between then that people don't often discuss, and that's some of the things that I want to do. Again, I will be looking at reports, articles, and all these sorts of different things to actually pull these out rather than just simply giving my opinion. Okay, so it says here, the consequence of historic injustices done to Negro Americans are silent and hidden from view. Okay, so there's a lot of stuff that happens within the Negro structure that is hidden and silent from view. Okay, but here is where the true injury occurred. Unless this damage is repaired, all the effort to end discrimination, poverty, and injustice will come to little. Okay, and it then goes into the white family has achieved a high degree of stability and is maintaining that stability. Okay, that was stated in 1965. Things have changed a lot for many families, and we will discuss all of these things because this is a really tangled discussion. But back then in 1965, you can see that there was a clear distinction between how the white family behaved and how the Negro family behaved. And one of the things that I really want to try and push on this channel is the fact that marriage and family building is essential to getting Black Americans moving forward, and also Black British families moving forward as well. And I will again focus on research and articles and stuff to actually prove all of this for everybody. Okay, so by contrast, the family structure of lower class Negroes is highly unstable. Okay, and in many urban centers is approaching complete breakdown. It says nearly a quarter of urban Negro marriages are dissolved. The rates are highest in the urban Northeast, where 26% of Negro women ever married are either divorced, separated, or have their husbands absent. And what are the, so I've put a question here of saying what are the stats now, and the stats are even more drastic than what this 26% was alarming back then. And I think the statistics now for any Negro woman that has married, or any Black woman that has married, that's around 80%. Okay, 80%, which is absolutely horrific. Okay, these numbers shouldn't exist, and we're going to look into some of the reasons why. Okay, so nearly one quarter, the next part is that nearly one quarter of Negro births are now illegitimate. Okay, so both white and Negro illegitimacy rates have been increasing, although from dramatically different bases. The white rate was 2% in 1940, and it was 3.07% in 1963. In that period, the Negro rate went from 16.8% all the way up to 23.6%. Okay, so you can see how low the white rate was at 2% in 1940, and then in 23 years it only jumps just over 1 percentage point. And then in the same period, 16%, which is already like 8 times what the white rate was, it then goes up to 23%. So that's over 10 times what the white rate was in the same time period. Okay, so that just shows you again, it comes down to the family structure. And then to make things even worse than what it was in 1963, as this report claims, it's now in 2025. Okay, because one of the reasons why I like using 2025 is because it's 60 years, over 60 years since that report was done, and the illegitimacy rate within Black America is 69.4%. Okay, 69.4%, pushing on to 70% when it was 23% 60 years ago. So that is absolutely horrific statistics, and we have to look into exactly what's going on here, and that's actually forcing this issue. Okay, and then the next part is almost 1/4 of Negro families are headed by females. They said possibly 8 in 10. Okay, possibly 8 in 10. Okay, and this so this is absolutely, again, so that's 25%. Okay, and I think the statistics are even worse, and I will actually do an episode on breaking down some of these statistics, because what we don't want to do is just simply isolate different or cherry pick statistics. We have to kind of use multiple statistics to build accurate and truthful picture of what is going on with the black family, because I'm also very much perplexed with exactly what's going on, because you see it all over social media, you see it in the music, you see it in the movies, and all of this stuff, until I found this out, because I had to listen to black men and black women, and also PhDs from both the white Americans, black Americans, to actually understand exactly what was going on. So I'm not doing this simply from my own back, but I'm trying to set up a foundation of using research, of using informed opinions, because if we're worried about this today, they were worried about this 60 years ago. And there's even research to go back to from people like E. Franklin Fraser, Kenneth Clark, because I think E. Franklin Fraser, so I've got Kenneth Clark's book, which is Dark Ghetto, and I think there's E. Franklin Fraser, which is the Negro Family in the United States, and then you've got W.E.B. Du Bois, and there are additional literature that I'm going to use to support my thesis and to support my theories. So I'm not just simply talking about it from my own perspective. So yeah, 1/4 of Negro families are headed by females, and this for me is one of the crucial aspects of why there was such a massive issue within the black family structure. And the thing is, you have to, one of the reasons what I want to do is actually keep defining these things, because it doesn't mean that because slavery happened and racism happened, that there weren't downstream effects. There are downstream effects, and you have to kind of look at them and try and accurately target them so you can actually remedy them. Okay. And then it further says, as a direct result of this high rate of divorce, separation, and desertion, a very large percentage of Negro families are headed by females. While the percentage of such families among whites has been dropping since 1940s, it has been rising amongst Negroes. Okay, and then what I've put there at the bottom is something called Aid to Families with Dependent Children, which is AFDC. So let me just read this again, because I want to try and break this down again. So when it comes down to the fact that the Negro families are headed by females, this type of family has been dropping in those 23-24 years before this report was coming out. So white families were actually getting it together and making sure that there were less female-headed households in the white community, but this was rising in the Negro community. And what this report will actually do is will actually give an explanation as to why these things are happening, and we're going to look into why the slavery and the racism caused this type of pattern of a female-headed household, and where did that all come from. And it is rooted in the slavery and in the racism in America. So let's go on to chapter 3. Okay, so the roots of the problem. So this is where it starts to now give us a little bit of an explanation. Okay, and with this explanation, you now you now get an explanation as to exactly what has gone wrong within the black community. Okay, so yeah. Okay, so let's do this. Okay, so yeah, so when we go into the roots of the problem, okay, so American slavery wasn't just harsher; it was categorically different from almost every other form of servitude in history. And the key to understanding the difference starts with religion and law. Okay, so this report is so comprehensive. Okay, it's so comprehensive because it really does begin to break down and give some really powerful reasons as to what happened for 400 years, and what I still believe are still effects that are still taking place today. Okay, so religion and law. So what they did is they actually compared Catholic versus Protestant traditions. Okay, and what they did is they actually studied Brazil. Okay, so one of the reasons why they studied slavery in Brazil is because Brazil was in the Americas. Okay, so similar to the USA. Okay, but then it was also shaped by Catholics. So even though Catholicism isn't a orthodox or a true branch of Christianity, it's still very close in terms of that dominant period when slavery was being practiced. Okay, so Brazil was shaped by a Catholic feudal tradition. Okay, so even though the Brazilians practiced slavery, and as it states here, slavery was very brutal, it still operated with a worldview that recognized the slaves as a human being with a place in society. Okay, so Brazilian slaves could marry legally. They had religious identity through baptism. Their families couldn't be sold apart. Okay, so this again goes down to the family structure. They had rest days, okay, and could earn money and could buy freedom. Manumissions were encouraged. If you don't know what manumissions are, this is simply where if you have enough children, your slave master could then grant you freedom. Okay, so manumission was encouraged, and enslaved children were often freed at baptism. Okay, so any children that came out of a marriage from a slave family, they were able to be freed once they had their baptism. Okay, in short, the Brazilian slave knew he was a man. Okay, he was still degraded, he was still oppressed, but still part of the Brazilian social order. Okay, but American slavery grew out of English law and Protestant theology, neither of which had a framework for human bondage or human slavery. Okay, so because Protestantism had no tradition for integrating slaves into religious hierarchy, enslaved Africans in the US were treated not as low-ranking humans, but as property, as chattel, as things, as a product. Okay, and we'll go. Okay, so we'll go. Yeah, so one of the reasons why this was uniquely devastating for black people is that they didn't have any rights. Okay, you were seen essentially as a product, and when you look into the damage that was done specifically to the male slaves, because I think when slavery started, it was very much about the males, not as much about the females, because the man was the key to the resource. Okay, because women slaves weren't as valuable. They became more valuable later on down the line once slavery was abolished, and then they decided to circumvent the system by actually producing slaves and breeding slaves, but we're not going to discuss that just yet. Okay, we'll discuss that later on down the line, because I actually want to create a foundation. Okay, so now this is where we start to contrast the slavery. Okay, so why American slavery was uniquely devastating. So in the United States, slaves had no legal marriage. Okay, so you couldn't marry any other slave, you couldn't marry a slave woman. Okay, you were never recognized as a family, and everybody knows to be recognized as a family, even though in today's day and age everybody thinks that as long as you're with a couple and you have a baby, that you are a family. No, family starts with marriage. Okay, it starts with marriage, and this is something that God has ordained within Scripture. So this is what we see. So in the US, slaves had no legal marriage. Families could be broken up at will. Okay, so that means if a couple get together, they have some babies, those slave children could be sold at any time. Okay, anytime. Okay, and this will go into how also the black male image was also destroyed. Okay, so their families could be broken up at will. Okay, children could be sold, women could be violated without consequence. Okay, and this again has so many ramifications because black women were not protected. Okay, the slave master. We've seen this in all the movies that have gone throughout the time. I won't discuss this at the moment. And obviously there's been literature written about exactly what happened to the women at this time. So as a man who was a slave, you could hear about what happened, you could see what happens to your woman, and you could do absolutely nothing about that. Again, this goes over to the destruction of the family. Okay, so whatever little threads they had as a family were actually being destroyed by the dominant society, by the slave master. Okay, and this is why it was so uniquely devastating. Again, we're contrasting both Brazilian slavery with American or United States slavery. Okay, so religious gatherings were banned unless overseen by whites. Okay, so any church services, any baptisms, anything of that ilk, communion, whatever it may be, they were banned. So there was no way to actually congregate as slaves, and also as well, from other research, people like David Carroll as well, what the slave master used to do back then as well was to actually talk to a couple of other slaves and get it for when they did eventually have their own gatherings. There would be a couple of slaves within the midst who would actually report back to the slave master so that the slave master knew exactly what was going on from the religious gatherings. And this is again unimaginable mistreatment. Again, going back to chapter 2, when people a lot of the dominant society don't understand exactly why the roots of the problem are so deep. And this is one of the challenges that I have for a lot of people that do want to discuss these things is, can you tell me what other groups of people have not just been slaves, okay, but they've also suffered the racism on top of it? Okay, because you can go to different parts of the world and slavery is practiced globally. It's still being practiced today, which is actually quite horrific. Okay, but what has happened in terms of, because I think you can see this in India as well, where the slaves are not treated as human and they've got the caste system, and I will reference ultimately other content as well and books and stuff to kind of go into more detail, but this is just setting the foundation. Okay, so learning to read was illegal. Okay, and the workings out of the fact that learning to read was illegal is that because the black man was only seen as a buck, so a worker, he was never afforded the opportunity to read. Okay, and this will later on go into why there is such a schism between both black men and black women in terms of the fact that the slave master preferred to educate the women, and this is a pattern which is still being practiced today, and we'll go into that. So freedom was discouraged, laws actively blocked manumission, so it didn't, I think was it only after maybe Jim Crow and segregation, where you could qualify for manumission, where you maybe had 10 to 12 children, and then you could have manumission. So again, Brazilian slavery wasn't like this, even though it was still terrible. It wasn't like this. So this wasn't the slavery of the ancient world, medieval Europe or Latin America. Okay, this was total de-racialization, cutting people off from past, family, religion, education, and hope. Okay, psychologists even compared it to Nazi concentration camps again. So this is the juxtaposition, because this is so important, especially for America. When you think about the Jews that came over to America, okay, they were given things like reparations. They were also made Americans to kind of help them assimilate into the United States. This was never afforded to black people or Negroes in America. Okay, everything, so much of what has happened in America can be pointed back to the Moynihan report. Okay, so one of the reasons why they compared it to Nazi concentration camps is that it was a closed system. It was total control, dependence on captors, and personality breakdowns that produced the Sambo stereotype. So not an African personality type, but a trauma response to domination. And again, this is why in reference to a lot of what goes on in America, they don't discuss or are able to actually not have a trauma response to the total domination that has happened to them. Again, total deracialization. So cutting people off from their past, their family, their religion, their education, and their hope. In other forms of slavery, because you might not have been sold off as a family, or you were still from your land, or you still were close to your land, okay, you could always maybe get word back or pass word back and forth between generations. Okay, and this is one of the things that didn't happen to black people. So as soon as a boy child was born and he was sold off, he had no information, nothing whatsoever about slavery, how to get out of slavery, how to deal with what he was going through. And this perpetuated a cycle, a trauma response from 12 to 15 generations of a pattern. Okay, and this is why my heart goes out to black Americans, because I'm just like, what the hell is this? And I'm going to go into the historical reasons in many of the subsequent episodes, because this stuff is so deep. When you think it gets bad, it gets even worse. So yeah, my heart really does go out to Americans, black Americans, and because this is essentially the system of white supremacy, which has really destroyed their mentality, destroyed their personhood. And I think this is against what God would want for any human being, but in particularly he wouldn't want it for black people. So going on to the next section, okay, so we talk about Reconstruction and Jim Crow, okay, and this is where the damage continues. So after emancipation, freedom came without equality, okay, so black men especially became targets of fear and hostility. So one of the reasons why racism isn't because people have this discussion about whether racism is worse for whether black people can be racist and white people can be racist. The racism that black people exhibit, the racism that white people exhibit on black people is a systematic institutional type of racism, and on the flip side of it, it's more fear-based. So when white people are when black people are racist towards white people, it produces a lot of fear in white people, and this is why you see a lot of black propaganda against black men. And even though, for example, when a white person is racist against a black person, it stops a black family from buying a home, from getting a job, from starting a business, from keeping their family intact. When a black man is racist to a white person, it just produces fear, and that's as far as it goes. And it might happen to be a fight, it might be a verbal slinging match, it might result in a murder. But yeah, it's very difficult for the two forms of racism, and this is why I talk about distinctions. We have to define how things are presented in society. Rather than trying to be extreme about things, we need to try and find what the truth is and try and define and provide distinctions exactly what has gone on historically. Okay, so then it says black men especially became targets of fear and hostility. Jim Crow and segregation stripped away male dignity, blocking the development of strong fatherhood. Everybody say with me, male dignity and strong fatherhood. A black man who didn't stay in his place risked violence or lynching. You can even go to murdering, hanging, chopping your Johnson off. Like, it was horrific. Okay, so Jim Crow and segregation stripped away male dignity, blocking the development of strong fatherhood. So this is the first it wasn't the first attempt of taking men away from their home, but this is one of the quickest ways of taking away black fatherhood from families. Okay, so urban migration. Okay, so I think urban migration is when the jobs there were no longer jobs in the south, so people just started to migrate to northern cities. Okay, it does say that. So the Great Migration brought millions to northern cities in a rapid jump from rural life to urban slums, similar to Irish immigrants a century earlier, but amplified by racism and poverty. And this is again why we have to define these terms, because black people were immigrants, but they were slave immigrants. So and I think, I'm not sure if I've put it down here, but there were other great groups of immigrants that came over to the UK after they came over to the US after black people. So you've got the Irish, you've got the Italians, and you've got the Jews. Okay, and if you go over to Crimson Cure and you watch her Moynihan playlist, she actually breaks this down. And because the Irish also suffered from moving to urban slums. Okay, so they were getting drunk as well. There was crime, there was poverty, there was disabandonment of families. So just to kind of give you a further point as well, is that the reason why Daniel Patrick Moynihan, when he was writing this report, he was actually an Irish immigrant, and his father left his mother, okay, and left him abandoned, but he was able to get educated and was able to work for the United States government. So this was pretty close to his heart. So he's not like one of those modern day liberal who's now trying to change people from straight to alphabet and all that sort of stuff. He actually wanted to try and make things better, and this is why he was very critical, very strong, and very honest in this report. And when I pull up my literature, and I'll show you the books that he referenced, because he worked with an American sociologist called Kenneth Clark, and I've got his book called The Dark Ghetto. So the actual reaction to this report, and I'll show some of the media clips in future videos about the backlash that came out from this report. So urban migration, a second shockwave. Okay, so the Great Migration brought millions to northern cities in a rapid jump from rural life to urban slums, similar to Irish immigrants a century earlier, but amplified by racism and poverty. Okay, so the result of urban migration, okay, so this is where they go into the slums or the ghettos. There was a father absence. Okay, there was a family breakdown, weak institutions. So the institutions within the black community were really poor, really bad. So this can be your churches, this could be your schools, this could be your charities, these could be your businesses, these could be your banks. Okay, they were all weak. Okay, and then there was youth delinquency. So this is where you get the hoods, you get the gangsters, you get the drug dealers, you get the pimps, you get all of that sort of stuff. Okay, then it referenced overcrowded ghettos like Harlem, and I think Thomas Sowell, he is very good on these sorts of things as well. And I think he's got a book called Rednecks and something. I'll double check that later on. But if you look at the low work, the proletariat, so the working class white community and the black community, they mirror each other very, very closely. Okay, so this goes back to because I don't really want to, I will define white privilege, because a lot of poor white people do not have privilege both in the US and in the UK. Okay, and they actually do align with black people, but they sometimes delineate themselves over to their ethnicity as opposed to their social class or their status within society. So all of these were symptoms of a massive social whiplash from such sudden modernization. Okay. So what happened? Okay, so unemployment was the silent destroyer. For 35 years, black men faced unemployment rates doubled that of whites. Okay, and when men can't work, the family collapses. Okay, research showed peaks in male unemployment were followed 1 year later by peaks in family breakdown. Work wasn't just income. It was identity, it was authority, and it was place. Okay, so this is your status, and you still see it now today. If you're not working as a man, you don't feel as if you are a man. Okay, so without it, fathers lost their role, mothers filled the income gap, and children lost the stability of a two-parent home. So yeah, so you can see that because of the slavery and the racism, it destroyed the identity, the authority, and the place of the black men in the family structure, and this is still being felt today. Okay, because we always hear from black Americans, fatherless homes, and I have a theory that it's not just I think fatherless homes are an issue. Okay, because there are still way too many guys who don't look after their kids, but I think, you know, and we'll look at the flip side of that, because what I want to try and do is I think blame is an important part of things, because it's very easy to blame the men, which I think can, in certain circumstances, is the right thing to do. But also you have to look to the flip side of things and see what is the other half of the equation doing, and how they've been affected by slavery, racism, Jim Crow, and segregation, because that hasn't been discussed, and the Moynihan report does discuss this. Okay. So what it says now: poverty makes the cycle spin faster. American wages were built for individual workers, not families. Even employed black fathers often couldn't support their households, pushing black women into the workforce and weakening family cohesion. Okay, so this is what you see again and again. You see that it's very difficult to raise your family when you've got when you don't have enough money to raise your family. Okay, and they often couldn't. Black men couldn't support their households. Okay, and this is why I referenced the AFDC in the first. I'll go back to it quickly just so people can see. So where was it here? I was in chapter 2. Yeah, so aid to families with dependent children welfare. So what they essentially saw at that time was something called Moynihan scissors, which was and it was essentially this graph. Okay, and what the graph kind of showed was the fact that when the men were unemployed, okay, the family broke down, and this happened across all demographics. Okay, but once unemployment, once the men started to get unemployed in the black community, the family structure still was decaying. It was still getting worse. So whether there was good rates of, whether there was an improvement of employment, or there wasn't employment, the rates of the family structure kept being broken down. So this kept affecting the structure. And I will again, I'll break this down in further detail in subsequent videos. So yeah, it's very, very troubling. So again, so where you see, so again, it weakened cohesion, and obviously black women had to step into that gap, which for most people you would totally understand. And a lot of it happened within the white community, it happened within the Latino community, it happened where more women started to go into the workforce. And I don't think most people and most men could actually totally understand that. But what in America, black women have always worked. They've always been in a position to actually do jobs to support the family. But what was different within the black community was that it didn't stop A, marriage, and B, it didn't stop family building. And this is the issue that they're still facing today. Okay, so what happened was that bigger families plus lower incomes meant millions of black children grew up without resources and needed to break the cycle. Okay, the next section, a rapid population boom. So when it came to black families, especially the poorest, they had more children, okay? And they had them earlier, deepening the opportunity gap. So by the 1960s, black youth unemployment was nearly 30%, and the population was growing faster than the economy could absorb. So again, this is the backdrop of exactly why they had to respond to this, okay? And they had to find out exactly what was going on within the community, okay? So essentially they had to find a way of getting the black community on their feet so they could absorb the issues that were happening within the black community, okay? So, and then the core okay, so the core message of this chapter, okay, so just to summarize it, what America faced in the 1960s wasn't just a social issue, okay? It wasn't just a social issue, it was the compounded fallout of a historically unique system of slavery, okay? So a unique system of slavery followed by racial terror, okay? Blocked economic mobility, urban dislocation, joblessness, and poverty, all reinforcing each other across generations, okay? So this is why I say that you have to, if we're going to be honest about what happened to black people in America, you have to cite these reasons, okay? You can't just say slavery and racism. You have to say there was racial terror, okay? That white people were actually scared of black people. They were, but then also, more importantly, black men were scared of white people because they didn't know whether they would be coming home on any given day, okay? Then there was blocked economic mobility for black men. Then when there were no jobs in the South, they had to move to the North, and this also created a cycle of poverty, joblessness, dislocation. Because if you think about it just from a rural perspective, a rural life is different from living in a city, okay? Everybody knows this. We've all done geography and sociology and all that sort of stuff, okay? So the chapter's thesis is clear. To fix the present, America must understand the deep structural wound at the root, a wound created by a form of slavery unlike any other form in the modern world. Okay, so this is why, again, if you look at, there's slavery being practiced across the world, but did they also suffer the racial terror, the blocked economic mobility, the urban dislocation, the joblessness, and the poverty in a perpetual cycle? Then you've also got the backdrop of the fact that they weren't humans, they weren't able to practice marriage, they were also, their children could be sold at any time. All of these different things show that the plight of the black family is one of the most destructive cases that has ever happened in human history. And I think this report is pretty hardcore, but I think it's pretty correct as well. So let's let me see if we can stop there. Okay, let's stop there. So yeah, I want to thank you for tuning in, and I hope, please drop a comment, drop a like, and that'll be really good, just to try and help this channel to grow, because I am doing this from a black British perspective, a black British man looking at it, because black Americans have been in the West for longer. It's wiser for us to look to you to see exactly what's happened over there, to see how we don't go down the same road that you have passed. And again, my heart goes out to black Americans, because I think this is a uniquely desperate situation that does need to be addressed, and I think one of the ways that we can do that is by, again, respecting their humanity, respecting their dignity. And this goes back to the Bible and the scriptures. And if you read the book of Genesis, where it talks about all creation, starting from Adam and Eve, were made in the image of God, and because of sin, because Adam sinned and Eve sinned, it's that all ethnicities have basically been at war with one another, doing wrong against another, and this is manifested in such a terrible situation for black people. And also this has been at the hands of white people, and we have to talk about that in a very honest way and in an honest discussion. So so please, again, if you do like this content, please drop a like, please share it with somebody, and I'll be back with you on the next one. God bless.